Hello everybody, welcome to US History. We're going to be talking more about the Cold War today and how it really heats up. Let's start with a very interesting development that happened right after the end of World War II. As you can remember, the devastation in this war was enormous, especially in Europe. You can just see some of the cities here that were completely devastated during World War II. So the United States decides to kind of go against what they did after the First World War, where they basically left and said, hey, best of luck guys, we're going to be isolationists now. The United States takes the opposite approach after World War II. They end up getting more involved in conflicts and things going on throughout the world. And this is really what makes America the superpower that we know today, is that we are going to go headlong into foreign entanglements, and we are going to be the leader of kind of this industrialized Western democratic world. So this all starts with the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, like I said, was to not repeat the mistakes of the post-World War I era and give massive economic aid to Europe. The war had caused 21 million people homeless. In Poland, 20% of everyone had died, because that's really where a lot of the fighting was the fiercest between the Nazis and the Soviet Union. 1 out of every 5 houses was destroyed in France and Belgium, and things like agriculture, industries, and transportation was just completely destroyed. So we kind of come up with this new deal for a new age. Kind of, we're going to fund the rebuilding of Europe. So that's what the Marshall Plan is. Marshall Plan is actually named after the Secretary of State in the United States at the time, a guy named George Marshall here. And it's actually passed in Congress. So this was a law that was passed to give a massive amount of money at the time, $44.3 billion, which, remember, with inflation is actually much higher now. So yes, it was a plan to rebuild Europe with American loans and aids. So what were some of the countries that joined? Well, a lot of the countries in Western Europe. This offer was extended to all the countries that had devastation during the war, but places like the UK, France, West Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, Switzerland, all these countries in Western Europe, and eventually a lot of countries in Asia also got aid from the Marshall Plan, and that came a little bit later. The Soviet Union was also given a chance to join, but they declined because they thought it was a way for the United States to gain economic control over Europe, and in some ways they weren't wrong. A lot of these loans came with some strings attached. And a lot of it was kind of, we will keep funding you and giving you money if you stay democratic, if you stay, pro-capitalist, anti-communist. So that's so the Soviet Union knew this and they said, we don't want your money. We're going to be doing things our own way. And this also kind of sets them up as the counterbalance in the world to the United States and the capitalist, democratic governments that they kind of represent. That the communists are trying to go a different way, and a way that they think is better. However, what ends up happening is that, there's the split between West and East Germany. The Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries, the communist countries, have control over the East, and West Germany is controlled by UK, France, and the United States. So this is, again, the kind of, democratic capitalist world versus the communist world. And the Soviet Union's part became East Germany. But the capital, the former capital of Germany, Berlin, was kind of right here in the middle of East Germany, but half of it was still considered American, French, and UK territory. So there's half of the city of Berlin here is actually part of West Germany. And what ended up happening was that a lot of people tried to escape from East Germany to the West. That's so Berlin ends up being this really, this sticking point after the end of World War II, where it gets rebuilt too, but half of it is kind of the westernized world, and then half of it is the more East and Soviet world, and this even becomes more clear with the building of the Berlin Wall, which actually happens later in the 60s, but it ends up becoming kind of a symbol of this divide in the world. So the Berlin Airlift, though, this comes much, much sooner than the Berlin Wall did, and what was it? So basically, Stalin didn't like people escaping East Germany through Berlin, and this is because people, this is where a bit of my bias is going to come out, but people didn't like communism. It tried to basically control people's economic activity so much so that they buckled against it rather than liking the freedom to kind of start their businesses and do whatever they wanted. So people really preferred, the Western democratic kind of capitalist consumer culture as opposed to the ones in communist countries. But the communist countries really didn't like this. They really thought that they could control human nature and change things eventually over time to have people want to live in this, in collectivized economies. But it ended up not really working out that way. They kind of thought there was going to be this new, Soviet man and this new, people who would embrace communism. And what happened was that when people were born into the system and they saw what was available in the West and all the choices and all the freedoms that you had, that people preferred that a lot more than staying in their country. So what happens is that people keep trying to escape from the Soviet bloc. They keep trying to escape from places like the Soviet Union, and they want to come to the West. And one of the big places that they ended up running through was this pocket in Berlin, where people could go from East to West Berlin, and then from West Berlin they could take a plane off and then run away from communist countries. So basically, Stalin decides to blockade food and everything going into Berlin. So Truman didn't want this to resolve in a war, so basically he creates something called the Berlin Airlift. This is where 200,000 British and Americans deliver things like food, fuel, and other supplies. So basically, instead of having the trains and cars bring things to, all the goods and services into West Berlin, we are just going to airlift them instead. And the Soviets gave up their blockade eventually after 2 years of West Berlin being exclusively supplied through airdrops. Eventually the Soviets decided, okay, this has gone on for long enough, and they ended up stopping their blockade. This is kind of a political cartoon of what was going on. You see Truman and Stalin there at a chess match, and they were trying to, this is kind of like, this is where the whole idea of like the world as a chessboard, and there's these two major powers, and they're trying to, influence each other in all sorts of ways. This is where, the world kind of is seen as a big chessboard. You can see Berlin there on the left, and Stalin's trying to shoot down with a blunderbuss there, kind of all these geese that are flying over with food and supplies for West Berlin. So that's just kind of a political cartoon about the Berlin Airlift and what was going on there. NATO. What is NATO? NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And why was it formed? Why couldn't the UN protect countries from communist aggression? Well, it was because the Soviets had veto power. So anytime the United Nations would say, come out with any sort of decree saying you can't, invade this country or do this or do that, anything that would be pro-Soviet Union, the Soviet Union had veto power to make sure that those kind of declarations didn't go through. So basically, the United States and other Western powers decide to go around this and start their own alliance system called NATO. And it was called, quote unquote, an association of democratic, peace-loving states. That's how they describe it. We're going to be talking about some of the things that the United States does a little bit later, which, it's kind of a black mark on our history when it comes to the idea of being peace-loving. Basically, what NATO is put together, and the idea is that if you attack one of those countries in this alliance, you will officially attack all of them. It is like an attack on all of them. And NATO still exists to this day, and it has many countries to where if you attack one, it's like attacking all of them. So it's even places like Australia, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada. If you attack any of these countries, it's like you're attacking all of them. And in response, the kind of Eastern Bloc, the countries that are allied with the Soviet Union, come up with their own version of NATO. It's called the Warsaw Pact. So this just kind of cements this divide in the world, where we have the Warsaw Pact and we have NATO, and they're right next to each other, and now they're kind of, they're starting to aim their weapons at each other. Just in case, there's no war yet, but in case there is, they're ready to go. And this is where the arms race begins. The USSR creates their first atomic weapon in 1949. The info on how to build one actually came from spies in the United States who worked on the Manhattan Project. The Soviet Union had a huge network of spies. This is kind of, if you like spy novels or spy movies, anything like James Bond and all that. This is really where that all kind of begins. The whole era of espionage and trying to get state secrets from, one of the two big superpowers in the world. But the USSR creates their first atomic weapon. That means the United States had, a monopoly on atomic weapons for about 4 years. But now that the Soviet Union can build their own, the United States decides to build more, and then the Soviet Union in response decides to build more of theirs. And eventually we have so many thousands of nuclear weapons, we actually have enough power to destroy all life on planet Earth. And this is still something that exists. We don't live in the terror of nuclear war like we used to when the Soviet Union was around, but it's still something to keep in mind that exists out there, that we have thousands of nuclear weapons that we can utterly just annihilate all life on Earth at any moment if we want to, which is pretty scary. And it's a scary power that no other country in world history has even come close to. And we also have, also leads to the policy of MAD, fittingly named, mutually assured destruction, to where kind of the idea is that if you use a nuclear weapon on us, we'll use a nuclear weapon on you, and we'll use our entire arsenal, and they will use their entire arsenal, and then just completely blow the other one up. So destruction on a huge level is mutually assured. So what was the arms race? It's just a build-up of nuclear weapons over time, especially in the 1950s. What is deterrence? It's basically the idea that you are going to deter the other country from attacking you because you realize that the consequences are going to be so terrible, not just for you, but for the entire Earth and the history of the world. And what is brinksmanship? Well, it's this idea that you go to the very brink of starting a nuclear war, but you don't really do it. And this all comes from the Secretary of State at this time, another guy named John Dulles. Here's a quote from him. He said, "Brinksmanship is, quote, the ability to get to the verge without getting into the war. It's a necessary art. If you cannot master it, you inevitably get into war. If you try to run from it, if you are scared to go to the brink, you are lost." So basically it's this idea that we'll do everything we can to get to the brink of nuclear war without actually getting there ourselves. Eventually, the Cold War ends up creating, because we're making so many nuclear weapons and we want to stay ahead of the Soviet Union, it kind of leads to this boom in technology. We have things like the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, or the ICBM. It's a long-range rocket. Russia had better ICBMs, but who had the better planes? It was the Americans. So this is where, there's a military buildup. Despite not being in a war, technically, there's still lots of production on military equipment, even though we're not actually using it. Just in case any sort of war joins out. So this kind of becomes a perpetual thing where it's like we need to stay ahead of the Soviet Union. We can't have them have a advantage on us. So we have to keep developing and researching all sorts of new technology. And this is where a lot of the things that we take for granted today, things like computers, like faster computers, like personal computers, and all the things that we just have around us, like even things like the highway system were invented just in case of a nuclear war, that like a lot of the modern world gets invented in a way thanks to the Cold War. And it's because of this fear that we were going to fall behind and that we were going to be outmatched by the Soviet Union. And this all comes to a head in the famous space race. I have what is Sputnik there. It's the very first satellite ever created. It was actually started by the Soviet Union. This leads to things like NASA being created, and it's going to lead to the space race, which will be a very dramatic and interesting part of some of the next stuff that we're going to learn in American history. All right, join me next time. I'm going to be talking about the world of spies. So if you like spies, if you like intrigue, that sort of thing, we're going to be talking about the beginning of Spies and the CIA and all these interesting things. All right, I will see you then. Bye-bye.